So if we could just kind of start this conversation off with you maybe telling us a little bit about yourself and what you do, and then we can go into some detail about the Kairos assessment and how you're using that for your executive coaching as well GTD coaching.
So my name's Robert Peake. I am an executive coach and a effectiveness coach by the Getting Things Done methodology as well. My background's in technology, particularly leadership in technology, a lot of startups and scale ups, and then consulting work around that. So my coaching practice increasingly is in supporting engineering leaders. And I also, more recently, also have a specialization in supporting neurodiversity, people with different neurodivergent conditions, in being able to increase their executive function and their overall effectiveness. So the coaching kind of spans a pretty broad range. Sometimes the two intersect, and sometimes they're separate, very specifically about individual performance, effectiveness, and well-being, or about topics in leadership.
And so reflecting on your journey, what was coaching like before you started using the Kairos assessment? If you can take us back, because I
Mhm.
believe you've been using the assessment for a long time now.
Very long
Do you
time,
remember
yeah.
what it was like before you integrated that with your coaching practice?
Well, I would say I was very green as a coach as well back then. So I think the early days of my coaching practice were more about me than they should have been, if that makes sense. So keen to deliver value, so keen to share in relation to what I knew, so keen to help that in some ways I think there was an element of sort of tripping over myself along the way to try to help and not really creating as much space as I now do for the client, for the unique ways in which their mind works, for the ways in which they best process and relate to not only information but revelations, what's coming forward from inside of them that's useful to address in the coaching.
Can you dig into that a little bit more, just in terms of how you're using the assessment now? Of course, you're still delivering great value, but it's less about you and more about the client that you're working with. Can you tell me more about that and maybe share a specific example around how the assessment is used to help your clients?
Yeah. So I'll start with a recent example that's kind of top of mind. As a greener coach, I would really want to try to pack things in terms of time, right? Give them as much as I can within the span of time allotted. And a very recent example of something that I would never do, never have done as a green coach that worked incredibly well is with someone who was an acknowledged very high mover. We started to dig into what that means for them in terms of how it reflects in meetings and in different aspects of their work that we were going to address in the coaching, and very quickly came to that it would be a really good idea within an hour-long coaching session to let him get up and stretch after about 25 minutes. So this is one example of what we call contracting in coaching, meaning not the formal legal contract of when we're going to get paid and when we meet, but that idea that we're figuring out who we are in relation to each other and how I can best support them, what the shared agreement is about our relationship. And in this case, the shared agreement was full permission to call it, for him to call it or for me to check in with him after about 25 minutes into the session, say where you're at. And invariably, for just every session, after literally a 3 minute stretch and get up and move around and grab a cup of tea and whatever, the client came back so refreshed, so energized, so ready to go that back half was, I know, significantly more valuable to him than if we hadn't taken that very short break. So I think that's just one of many examples of how you can modulate your approach using the Kairos assessment, but not only modulate it because you have more information, but modulate it because they have more information as well. And you're both looking together in a collegial manner at what the results are, what might make sense, and coming up with solutions together to best address how they process information.
Has there been any resistance in taking the Kairos assessment from your clients?
Well, a little bit. So as I mentioned, I deal with engineers and highly technical people, a lot of data scientists, for example,
Hmm.
and they've often been quite skeptical of what you might call broadly psychometrics of any kind. Things like saying, "How is the Myers-Briggs any different than a horoscope?" This
Sure.
kind of this kind of attitude toward those kinds of assessments. So what I say to them is that, look, this is a theory-based assessment that's really well grounded in having been normed against some standards. And what it does is it shows how people generally fall into these different categories in terms of percentile ranks as well, not just a you're a green or you're a blue, but you're two standard deviations away from what most people are in terms of this grouping of preferences. And it's not a predictive test, right? It's not a Seligman or a Hogan or one of those that's trying to sort of say, if you answer these questions this way, we can tell how good you'll be as a salesperson or this or that. And it's also non-clinical, right? It's non-clinical and non-judgmental. It's just about what's true for you as information. And so what I say is this is a starting point to a conversation that's always going to be grounded in your real experience. And the intention is let's figure out how to work together really optimally in relation to how your mind works. With that little spiel, usually condensed and usually just addressing one or two aspects based on their questions, I've not had any resistance kind of since then, because I do think the assessment strikes a really lovely balance between not being highly predictive, prescriptive, behavioral, and fixed mindset approach to sort of pigeonholing you, but also having some good science and some good statistical grounding behind it. So it's a credible evaluation that also is the kind of evaluation I want to do to open up a conversation rather than, in a sense, measure the psychology of performance.
So at that point, they're on board, they're ready to take the assessment, they go through the questionnaires and get the results. Is there an aha for them? Are they typically happy with the results that they get?
Well, yeah, it varies. It varies a lot. I've had clients for whom I feel like that just that brief work in relation to the Kairos to set up the contracting and set up the rest of the coaching. I know for them that was hugely valuable, potentially even on a small scale, sort of life changing or certainly life enhancing in terms of how they sometimes are given permission, frankly, to
Sure.
be the way they are in ways that society hasn't always necessarily reinforced as the optimal, and sometimes just given nuggets that are useful for them to carry away into their life to just make things a little easier and a little more
Mm.
friction free for them. So I've had that extent of it. I've had people to some extent go more, well, that's nice, and for me it's always valuable because
Mm.
it always gives me insight into how to contract with them, how to support them, and what to look out for in terms of how I'm modulating my communication and also just modulating things like the pace of the sessions, the kinds of things we bring up, and the format in which we bring those things up to support them. So it certainly has ranged from neutral positive to incredibly useful for my clients. And it's always useful for me, is what I would say.
And now, taking a step back, I imagine when you brought in the Kairos assessment, there's a lot of assessment tools out on the market. Was there anything in particular about the Kairos assessment, which was probably called the cognitive preference survey at the time, right? Was there anything about ours that stood out? Why did you decide to use our assessment when there's so many other certainly well known assessments out on the market?
Yeah, I think one of the big things for me is that I found the Kairos personally very valuable. So I can speak from sort of lived experience to people about why this is potentially useful and even draw on some of my own kind of war stories about the process. As a result, when I'm, for example, dealing with someone very sequential and I'm much more preferent toward associative, I know what I need to be looking out for as a conscious competence that I need to bring to that engagement
Mm.
versus potentially going a little more unconscious. And the same is true with someone else who's also highly associative. I now know a lot more about what and how I need to contract with that very specifically. all of the other psychometrics that I administer, I've also obviously taken and done and found value in. But this to me is the one that really sets the tone nicely. If nothing else, it addresses the meta level of, hey, all of our minds work differently, and we're going to find some common ground in a really collegial way.
Can you
Most
tell
of
me
the other
more about?
assessments are about you and how you are, and let's look at
Sure.
that together. But this is one where we can really find common ground and share in the understanding that no two brains are alike, right? And we're going to be going on a coaching experience. And because I'm a different person than you, and I'm seeing you through my filters and you're seeing me through yours, we're going to be working together on having this kind of relationship that's really all about how do we figure out together how to help you get what you want more. And that's what coaching to me is at its best. So this serves that, I think, really, really well.
I like that you said you used the word setting the tone.
Hmm.
Can you tell me more about that?
Setting the tone to me is hugely important in coaching because I think if you don't establish the kind of tone that's I've found optimal as an environment for coaching, it's very easy to fall back into old patterns. There's all kinds of relationships out there, and our most formative one is parent-child, right? There's teacher-student, there's mentor-mentee, there's colleague, there's manager and direct report. And in the coaching relationship, I find you really want something that feels collaborative, that feels like you're both sort of working together and that you're never losing sight of what the individual has stated that they want. So a big part of that contracting process is bringing
Hmm.
out and drawing out what success is going to look like for the engagement. So setting the tone that it's not about really me holding any cards back so that you also then as a client have permission, to really kind of open up and we look at things together rather than with some sense of me scrutinizing or me being here and you being there. And the Kairos is that way too, by its nature. It's very much about just very, very neutrally or really positively stating some of the strengths and challenges of each and every one of these different information processing modalities and types. So it meshes very nicely with my kind of philosophy of how coaching works best. And it sets up and reinforces that idea that everything we're doing here is really an experiment, right? Coaching is an experiment, iteratively, session on session, figuring out how do we work together to get you more of what you want. And one of the kind of foundational parts of that is how do we help you raise awareness about how you learn and work and think and process best so that we can then take that into the coaching and you can also take that in to experimenting more with being kind of more of who you are and accentuating the strengths and mitigating the challenges of that.
Robert, can you walk me through your process for interpreting Kairos results? Is there a specific cognitive preference that you look at first? Guide me through that process.
So they take the assessment, they get the results, I get the results, I look over them, and when we go into this session, there's sometimes other elements. The sessions for me are very much guided by what has their attention, then in collaboration with here's some thoughts from me as well about where we can go. So again, setting that tone, the agenda and the way in which we're doing this is a process of iterating on how can you get the most value session on session. But very, very often in the first session, that gravitates right toward Kairos. And I mean, the first thing I ask is what stood out to you, or what did you notice about the assessment? So if they have some particular heat or energy or enthusiasm for a certain part, or they have questions or anything like that, I want to deal with that first, right? So that we're in that mode rather than a sort of educational mode or a formulaic mode where I'm walking them through the process.
Are there
Um,
typical are there specific preferences that they normally that stand out for them?
well, the one that often stands out that often we go to first is the associative versus sequential.
Hmm.
And this one to me is really, really important for, again, more of a tone setting, that these are very, very different modalities and preferences. And as you can see, it's a two-humped camel, right? It's not a bell curve. It's rather polarized in society. And so being able to understand For example, when context and story and all of that will be compelling, and when sort of rule and process and system will be compelling, and that not everyone gravitates toward both very often is just a really useful backdrop and entry point to a much bigger conversation about how we're all kind of different. That's the first one. That's often the most powerful one because it's the most sort of universally powerful one, right? Everybody gets, I think, something always out of the associative sequential conversation. So we start there. And actually, I typically move left to right across the tabs because I want to address all of them. So I move in the
Mm-hmm.
sequence that the report is given. But I would say, in particular, things like high talker, high mover, when those come up, those are often real opportunities to support people in giving themselves permission to process information in ways that society, since the Middle Ages anyway, hasn't always supported with rank and file desks and reading quietly to yourself, right? So I, at that point, raised the point that I think Frank originally made that if you were in ancient Greece, you'd be wandering around and asking lots of good questions and taking in your environment, right? And that would play to much more of your strength there. So it is a non-clinical assessment, but certain neurodiverse conditions sometimes tend to gravitate towards certain preferences rather than others. And in the whole kind of neurodiversity space, there's often, again, a sense of not having been given permission to be who you are, or
Mm.
quite the opposite, having gotten a lot of negative messaging. I think it's in the thousands by the age of 10, for example, with people with ADHD in terms of negative messaging. So it's an opportunity to give them a space to affirm that how they think is okay, certainly okay with me, and that they can kind of often sort of drop the mask, drop the need to conform to a social contract that's really not well drawn up for them, and that we can pull together our own contract of how we work, how we do this. That's often a huge relief. So when some of these things come up that are far to one side or the other of the curve, addressing that in a positive way, that in itself produces a lot of value for people.
This is kind of our final question. What would you say if someone was hesitant about using the Kairos assessment in their own practice?
Well, I think the first thing is to take it for yourself and see what it brings forward. I think the write-ups are good, right, in terms of the way that it relates to strengths and challenges, the way it lays all that information out. And when you do, I think one of the things to notice is what your own response is to that, where you have the kind of ahas. And if you can do someone else that you're close to as well and start to see the contrast and the difference there, that can start to tell you a lot about the value of having two Kairos assessments rather than one, which is what you'll have in a coaching relationship. You'll have yours and theirs and be able to compare. So for me, it was having the assessment and my wife having the assessment as well, and coming to a realization that as someone with a very high talking and listening preference relating to someone with a very low talking and listening preference, her walking by my desk and saying, "Oh yeah, by the way, I've got yoga on Thursday," didn't guarantee that on Thursday night I would say, "Hey honey, have a good time at yoga." But putting in my calendar absolutely would. And there was no difference in caring in our relationship, but there was a real strong difference in the interpretation of whether or not that information was easy for me to process. So those little things, those little moments when you start to realize how those add up in a relationship, and you start to realize how some very simple and practical things can change a relationship positively. I think if you extrapolate that into your coaching practice, and if you really understand the value and the importance of contracting, of being client-centered and client-focused, I think it's then a no-brainer.
Thank you for your time today. I really appreciate joining and sharing more about your practice and a bit about the assessment and how
Totally my
your
pleasure.
clients are
Yeah.
using that.
It's something I really enjoy using and really find tremendous value in, and my clients have for many, many years. So very happy to talk about it with anybody.
Thank you, Robert.